Hi YouTube! In this video I will be looking at the documentary A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, produced by Bart Sibrel. I did actually tackle this in an earlier video, but this was right at the start of my YouTube career, and I think I can do a better job now. I also made the mistake of addressing only the main so-called smoking gun evidence from the documentary. This resulted in many comments from hoax believers who simply denied this as being important and chose some other claim from the film as their personal smoking gun. So this time around I intend to address every single claim that is made in the film. Many of the popular arguments made by Apollo hoaxers come straight from this movie, so I hope this video will act as a useful resource for debunking hoaxer claims in general, rather than just a debunk of the movie itself. Finally, before we go any further, I want to make an important point to any flat earthers who are here. The main claim in A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon is that the Apollo missions were faked using terrestrial sound stages and footage shot from manned space flights in low Earth orbit. Almost without exception, flat earthers do not believe that manned space flights in low Earth orbit are in any way possible. So if this is your view, you must reject this movie as being fundamentally flawed in what it says is its most important premise. I find it astounding that many flat earthers hold this movie up as a killer blow for the Apollo moon landings, when they cannot possibly believe its main smoking gun claim is even possible, let alone true.
Since the beginning of recorded history, the human race has been at war. First with members of their own family, then their fellow countrymen, and finally nations at large.
The film starts by proposing that human beings have an inherent warlike nature. It goes on to tell the stories first of the Tower of Babel, and then of the maiden voyage of the Titanic. These two examples are used to imply that when human beings allow their dreams to get too big, they are inclined to end in failure. The final part of this introduction section introduces the Cold War space race, highlighting the early successes of the Soviet Union and suggesting that because the Hubble Space Telescope had issues with its mirror when it was launched in 1990, this somehow indicates that the Apollo moon landings could not have been successful. The introduction concludes with this.
With close scrutiny of the motives of the zealous Nixon administration, a critical examination of the entirely government-controlled press coverage, and newly discovered footage of the crew of Apollo 11 staging part of their mission, we wish to detail what may come to be the greatest government conspiracy of all time. A funny thing happened on the way to the moon.
The introduction is followed by yet more scene setting. First we get 2 minutes of missile tests and failed launches, the implication being that the early US space program was just a series of disasters. This is followed by some quotes about the challenges faced by the space program from head of the Apollo program Wernher von Braun, head of the US Army Ballistic Missile Command Major General John Madaris, and Presidents John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson. Finally, we're treated to a full 2.5 minutes of the launch of Apollo 11, coupled with some weirdly creepy music, and juxtaposed with footage of famine, war, and social unrest. Part 1. The Van Allen Radiation Belts. Now we get to one of the main claims made in the movie, a point which Sibrel repeatedly returns to throughout, that the Van Allen radiation belts cannot be crossed by human beings. Here are some excerpts of the arguments presented to establish this point.
Unbeknownst to the citizenry, high above the Earth lay lethal bands of radiation called the Van Allen radiation belts. Every space mission in history with humans on board has been well below this deadly radiation field. In order to survive the hour-and-a-half journey through this radiation field necessary to reach the moon and return, solid lead shielding between the astronauts and the exposure outside would be required. That is why the Soviets, though more advanced, only sent an unmanned probe to the moon. The Apollo spacecraft's narrowest shielding was less than 1/8 of an inch of light aluminum. In 1998, the Space Shuttle flew to an altitude of 350 miles, one of its highest altitudes ever, that the astronauts inside of their shielded spacecraft and inside of their shielded spacesuits saw flashes of light with their eyes shut due to radiation penetrating the retinas of their closed eyes. As a result, CNN issued the following report noting NASA's unpredicted surprise. The radiation belt surrounding Earth may be more dangerous for spacewalking astronauts than previously believed. Scientists say the phenomena known as the Van Allen belts can spawn killer electrons when the Earth's magnetic field changes.
The possibility of charged particles surrounding the Earth had been investigated prior to the space age by scientists such as Christian Birkeland, Carl Stormer and Nicholas Christopoulos. The first US satellite, Explorer 1, under James Van Allen of the University of Iowa, made the first detection of the belts in 1958, although this was initially thought to be a fault in the detector, but was later confirmed by the Explorer 3 satellite and by subsequent US and Soviet satellites. This was the first major scientific discovery of the space age, and it was heavily publicized in popular media. It made James Van Allen a household name. Newspapers even wrote articles about his wife and home life, so the claim that the public were unaware of the radiation belts is obviously untrue. The Gemini 4 mission was flown through the South Atlantic anomaly, a part of the radiation belts which drops close to the Earth, specifically for the purposes of testing the spacecraft's radiation shielding capabilities. Gemini 10 also carried 3 radiation experiments and flew over 400 miles from Earth to make its radiation measurements. Although the Soviets did not send humans through the radiation belts, they did send and recover a collection of live animals on their Zond 5 mission. This was the first spacecraft to orbit the Moon, and it carried a biological payload of 2 Russian tortoises, wineflies, mealworms, plants, seeds, bacteria, and other living matter. The first Earth life forms to travel around the Moon and return safely. All of the spacecraft since Apollo have maintained low Earth orbits, so by definition only they avoid the radiation belts. Solid lead shielding is used for protection against X-rays and gamma rays. These are produced by nuclear reactions, atomic bombs, and to a much lesser degree nuclear reactors. This is not the type of radiation that forms the Van Allen radiation belts, which are made up of high-energy charged particles from the Sun, alpha particles, beta particles and protons that become trapped by the Earth's magnetic field, creating inner and outer donut-shaped belts around the Earth. This protects humans on Earth from any detrimental effects, but creates a potential hazard for space travellers. Alpha particles are very large and so don't penetrate very deeply into many things. In fact, alpha particles will not even penetrate the outer layer of our skin, and so present no special hazard to humans. A sheet of reasonably thick paper will block all alpha particles. Protons penetrate further. They can be shielded by light metals, or plastics in thicknesses of about a centimetre, such as the aluminium skin of the Apollo craft and its epoxy resin heat shield. Beta particles are very small, and can penetrate centimetres into the body, but luckily they're too small to cause much damage if they hit anything. But there's a special problem here. When beta particles hit large atoms, the impact causes those atoms to give off X-rays. Metal atoms are usually quite heavy, and so are especially susceptible to this kind of re-radiation, which is known by its German name, Bremsstrahlung. In fact, this is how X-rays are produced intentionally for medical applications. So solid lead shielding would be one of the worst possible materials to use, as it would generate a lot of dangerous X-rays. The best materials to shield against beta particles have lots of hydrogen atoms in them. Hydrogen atoms are light and so absorb the particles without giving off X-rays. Plain old water works very well, but water is impractical for shielding in space, so high-density polyethylene, which contains lots of hydrogen atoms, is frequently used instead. This also effectively blocks protons. The hull of the Apollo command module contained a layer of fibrous insulation material that would have offered similar protection, along with its inner aluminium hull. Radiation exposure is cumulative, meaning that the longer you're exposed to it, the worse the effect it has. So the NASA mission planners chose a route that avoided the inner radiation belt entirely and avoided the most dangerous part of the outer belt. This diagram shows the trajectory of an Apollo craft around the most dangerous parts of the radiation belts. The red dots here represent 10-minute intervals, so we can see that the exposure times were very limited. We also know the radiation dose of each astronaut because they wore dosimeters and regularly reported the readings to mission control, and these readings are recorded in the Apollo Flight Journal. This claim seems to be based on Sibrel's belief that radiation shielding needs to be bulky. The heat shield was 5 centimeters thick at the deepest parts, but such measurements are largely irrelevant. The command module shielding was just part of the radiation exposure reduction strategy. CNN reported only that the Van Allen belts were slightly larger in places and slightly denser than previously understood. This is not a new reality, merely a refinement of existing figures. We are still studying the Van Allen belts and must occasionally revise our numerical models. We can see just from this first section that Sibrel has mischaracterized the Van Allen radiation belts as an impassable barrier, so deadly they had to be kept secret from the public. The evidence shows that this is simply not the case, and is an idea that relies on a fundamental misunderstanding of the physics involved. In the next part we will see how this mischaracterization technique continues, with an assessment of the early space program, and is used to present hoax as the only option available to NASA. Part 2. The early US space program. In this section, Sibrel attempts to characterize the early US space program and sets up the hoax. First, I'll identify the claims made in the movie, and then address them one by one.
When the Soviet Union launched mankind's first satellite, Sputnik, in 1957, there was grave concern that they had mastered space ahead of the United States and might use this advantage to launch a first nuclear strike from an orbit high above North America. Concern turned to fear and then horror as America watched their communist enemy achieve all these firsts with no hope in sight of ever catching up. If it was impossible to better the Soviets in the space race, which was really a race of technological armaments, what could be done? How could America offset the threat of superior weaponry? Throughout the history of rivalry and war, astute generals of lesser armies than their counterparts have used deceit and misinformation as a method to achieve victory. In keeping a secret of the magnitude of the Apollo missions being fraudulently created, one turns to the Manhattan Project for comparison. Surreptitiously building the first nuclear bomb during the early to mid-1940s involved 129,500 people over a 3-year period. Yet the secret did not get out.
The USA kicked off the space race on July 29, 1955, when they announced plans for an Earth-orbiting satellite to be launched for the International Geophysical Year in 1958. The Soviets responded 4 days later when they announced plans for a similar satellite to be launched in the near future. Although it's true that the Soviets took an early lead following Sputnik in October 1957 with an impressive list of firsts, their failures were not made public like those of the United States, such as the very public failure of the Project Vanguard launch. Despite this, there is no reason to believe that the USA had no way to catch up with Soviet space development. The USA had the expertise in the form of more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers and technicians who were recruited from Germany at the end of World War II and had a proven track record in rocket engineering, along with skilled scientists and engineers from the USA and other countries. Existing research and engineering from the Army Ballistic Missile Agency and the United States Naval Research Laboratory, and the organisational advantage of tying all these resources into a single civilian agency with the formation of NASA in 1958. They also had the vast resources and budget of a superpower nation and the political desire to correct the space technology gap. Sibrel offers no reasoning at all for this no-hope claim, or for a subsequent claim that it would be impossible for the USA to catch the Soviets. How could this possibly be true of a nation so well resourced for the task? Ultimately, the Soviet lead was fairly short-lived. This chart shows how the USA, represented here by the blue line, soon surpassed Soviet space experience in 1965 as the Gemini program progressed. The threat of superior weaponry clearly is offset by developing similar superior weaponry and not by achieving a lunar landing, even though there are some obvious crossovers in the technologies. The Soviets have never achieved even a manned lunar orbit, and yet have maintained an effective intercontinental ballistic missile deterrent to the present day. Some politicians at the time, such as Senator Barry Goldwater and Senator William Proxmire, argued that the civilian space program was pushing the more important military one aside. When President Kennedy met with Soviet Premier Khrushchev in 1961, he suggested a joint landing with the Soviets, and repeated this offer in a speech at the United Nations in September 1963. If a lunar landing was the only way to get ahead of the Soviets, why would Kennedy twice ask them to share the mission? The Manhattan Project would be a good candidate for the worst kept secret in history. Convicted Soviet spies who infiltrated the project and passed many secrets to the Soviet Union included Klaus Fuchs, Harry Gold, David Greenglass, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, George Koval and Theodore Hall. Next, Sobral proposes potential cost savings of hoaxing the mission, and suggests how the hoax could have been achieved. Again, I will highlight a list of claims first and then address them one by one.
The cost of the program, whose sole goal was to be the first to plant a flag on the lifeless rock just outside the Earth, if adjusted for inflation to the 21st century, was $135 billion. With a profit margin of just 7%, this would be equal to over $9 billion profit going to the privileged contractors chosen by their friends at NASA. If the machinery was in fact only achieving Earth orbit, as other earlier missions had already done, then the completion and functionality of the other components would not have been as important, and even more profit would have been made. Just 1 year before the first mission to the Moon, NASA launched the Tetra satellite, specifically designed to simulate flight data coming from the Moon, so that the ground crews could rehearse the landing, much as the astronauts did in their own simulations. Had it not supposedly fallen back to Earth, all that would have been needed during the actual flight would be a repeat of one of these computer programs, with a few original variations, transmitted to the satellite for rebroadcast to Houston. Scores of computers and their deceived operators on the ground would then receive prearranged information, including the alleged location, altitude and fuel consumption of the spacecraft, as if it were descending to the Moon's surface. If the Soviets tried to find the actual location of an Apollo crew in the hundreds of thousands of miles surrounding the Earth and the Moon, it would be tantamount to trying to find a rowboat in the Atlantic Ocean. The fact that the Apollo program was so departmentalized, with various construction and test sites around the country, meant that only a few people saw the whole picture. And for the first time ever, there was no independent press coverage of such an historical event. Whatever pictures and sound were distributed to the public were strictly controlled and previewed by the federal government. They were then disseminated unchecked until this hour. For who would realize that the unthinkable was not only possible, but absolutely true?
It would take a long time to really examine the mathematics here, but we can see some obvious blunders. Sobral has taken the entire Apollo budget and assigned it all to contractors, when of course large amounts were spent on construction and equipping of facilities, most of which are still in use as government buildings today, and on the wages of employees working directly for NASA. Whilst it's true to say that a large proportion of the budget did go to contractors, the idea that this was just a collection of backhanded deals is absurd. There were over 500 main contractors and subcontractors in a wide array of industries. For money to be saved, the contractors who build the spacecraft and their engineers, along with hundreds of NASA engineers and quality assurance personnel, would have to know not to build a spacecraft capable of going to the Moon, but instead to build a cheap stage prop or build nothing at all. This means bringing many hundreds of people in on the hoax. Even junior engineers working on such a project would be aware that what they were producing was not fit for purpose. The alternative to this is to not tell the contractors about the hoax and have them and their engineers build a spacecraft capable of a lunar landing. But this negates any cost saving and negates the reason for a hoax. Tetra A was a very small satellite fitted with an S-band transponder, launched to provide training to the manned spaceflight network, allowing them to develop and verify target acquisition and handover techniques using the S-band system. NASA launched a number of similar satellites in the late 60s and early 70s. The manned spaceflight network was a series of receiving stations around the world, on land, ships and aircraft, which received signals from space and relayed them via radio transmission and landlines to the Mission Control Center. So it is true to say that NASA mission controllers were just receiving data via landlines and would have no idea of its origin. Consequently, a satellite was not required to train them and would not be required to fool them either. The manned spaceflight network is a very different matter. The operators here absolutely can't be fooled by a satellite. Their antennas must be precisely aimed. As seen from Earth, an Apollo spacecraft on a translunar trajectory would always be in roughly the same direction as the Moon. But Tetra A was orbiting the Earth once every 92 minutes, so from a point on Earth it would appear to streak quickly across the sky. The manned spaceflight network operators took great pride in being able to use the Doppler shift of the radio signals to determine the flight path of the Apollo spacecraft. When compared later with flight records, they even observed motion of the spacecraft due to such subtle effects as waste dumps and sublimator operation. So Tetra A would not be required to fool the mission controllers, and would have no chance of fooling the manned spaceflight network operators. The Apollo spacecraft were tracked optically from Earth all the way to the Moon and back by hundreds of amateur and professional astronomers. There are hundreds of recorded observations of the missions from all around the world, including live TV broadcasts of the spacecraft in flight. A few amateurs were able to receive radio transmissions from the spacecraft in flight and even from the astronauts on the surface of the Moon. This Russian website gives an account from E. Molotov, a Soviet technician who was tasked with testing Soviet communications for their planned lunar program using transmissions from the Apollo craft. Using a 30-meter dish in the Crimea, his team were able to receive voice telemetry and TV transmissions from the spacecraft. This is another mischaracterization. NASA published highly detailed descriptions of the engineering and detailed mission plans. The independent press scrutinized and reported on all of this, along with construction and testing of the engineering and training of the astronauts. The missions themselves were covered by hundreds of reporters at Mission Control, who could hear astronaut transmissions from the spacecraft broadcast live over loudspeakers, along with regular NASA public affairs updates on the progress and status of the astronauts and spacecraft. This is not strict government control by anybody's standard.
We are now about halfway through the film, and so far Sibrel has provided us with his fundamental misunderstanding of physics, along with totally unfounded and illogical reasoning to support his hoax idea. In part 3, he offers supposed evidence of this hoax, with an analysis of Apollo photography. Part 3. Fake photos. Now we get to the part of the film where Sibrel offers evidence of this supposed unavoidable fakery, starting with the photographs taken on the Apollo missions. First though, he makes these photography-related arguments. I'll identify the claims made first, and then address each in turn.
And what of the photographs? What do they tell us? On 3 separate occasions, our office asked NASA's Public Relations Department for every single picture of an astronaut on the surface of the Moon, just during the maiden voyage of Apollo 11. Many duplicates were sent. In all, fewer than 20 pictures were found, including first-hand investigation on site at the agency's vaulted archives. It is estimated that in just the first 60 minutes on the Moon, motivated by the tenuous nature of the circumstances, many more exposures could have been expediently taken. Also surprising is the scarcity of photographs of the mission's chief pioneer, Neil Armstrong. There is only one full-body picture of him on the Moon, besides this ghostly reflection. This one, taken by an automatic camera mounted on the side of the lunar module. Perhaps he feared liability should the whole conundrum later become unraveled. In fact, in the more than 30 years since the event, aside from NASA's initial press conference and the occasional brief anniversary remarks where few questions were permitted, he has never given one on-camera interview to anyone, ever.
During their time on the lunar surface, known as the Extravehicular Activity, or EVA for short, the Apollo 11 astronauts used 3 cameras in addition to the TV camera. Mounted on a bracket in the window of the lunar module was the data acquisition camera. This was a 16mm film camera which Aldrin used to film Armstrong's first steps and first sample collection. He then set this camera to run automatically at 1 frame per second before joining Armstrong on the lunar surface. The lunar surface close-up camera was used to take 35mm stereoscopic pairs of images of 3-inch square areas of the lunar surface. The 70mm Hasselblad EL data camera was used by both astronauts to take photographs during the EVA. There are 23 photographs which include astronauts. The claim that there are fewer than 20 is incorrect. Sibrel doesn't explain why he thinks this is significant, or why he thinks there should be more. The EVA lasted 2 hours and 13 minutes from the moment Armstrong stepped on the Moon until the moment he stepped off. Aldrin was on the Moon for 1 hour 47 minutes, so this was all the time available for one astronaut to take a photograph of the other on the lunar surface. During the EVA, the astronauts took 123 photos with the 70mm Hasselblad and 17 stereo pairs with the lunar surface close-up camera, 140 photographs in total. We can see from the Apollo 11 lunar surface operations plan that each astronaut had a set series of tasks that they had to perform. Aldrin had to deploy 3 science experiments, and Armstrong had to photograph him doing it. This was to provide data on the locations of the experiments and on the ability of astronauts to work on the Moon. This is also the reason that the photos are of Aldrin and not of Armstrong. There are specific instructions in the plan for Armstrong to photograph Aldrin, but none for Aldrin to photograph Armstrong. The astronauts also shot 5 360-degree pans to provide location data for the landing site and sample collection sites. In this one, Aldrin captured Armstrong, working at the side of the lunar module, the only photograph from this camera of Armstrong on the Moon, and a photograph which Sibrel neglected to mention. So we can see all of the photography had a very definite purpose: to maximise the value of the data gathered and to help enable future missions, not to snapshot astronauts. Sibrel mentions a single picture of Armstrong from the data acquisition camera. There are actually over 1,400 pictures from this camera that feature Armstrong, hundreds of which show his full body. Again, I am not sure why this is supposed to be important, or how Sibrel could possibly think that this camera only recorded a single image. Neil Armstrong is probably one of the most famous human beings that has ever lived. To suggest he might be trying to disassociate himself from an event of this magnitude is beyond ridiculous. He was photographed many times throughout his career. Even allowing for the years since this film was made, this claim is patently false. Although Neil Armstrong didn't give many interviews, there are a number to be found here on YouTube. The Giant Step Apollo 11 Presidential Goodwill Tour carried the Apollo 11 astronauts and their wives to 24 countries and 27 cities in 45 days. During the tour, they gave many press interviews.
Okay, let's take a look at some supposedly anomalous photographs. I won't make an on-screen list of the claims made this time, as you won't be able to see the photos. As always, I will address each one after the clip from the film.
From an analytical standpoint, photographic anomalies have to be sought out with an understanding of lighting and shadows. The most straightforward is simple. When objects are lit solely by the sun, then all shadows, regardless of the landscape, will run parallel with one another and never intersect, as shown by this example. In these seldom seen photographs, obtained from a rarely used auxiliary NASA archival site, it is clear that these scenes were lit with artificial light. These shadows, which are cast at different angles, are evidence that a second light source is being used. In addition, the sun would not cause an isolated hotspot like this, only an artificial light would. It is simply impossible for this picture to have been taken with sunlight on the moon. Here, the shadows are shown to be as black as pitch. And yet here, completely in a shadow, the astronaut is lit up like a Christmas tree. How can this be? In this magnification of an Apollo photograph, a rock, very likely a papier-mâché prop because of the crease here, is categorized with the letter C. In later releases of the same picture, the letter is gone, probably airbrushed out. Here, a crosshair, which was burned directly into the image from the film plate, and thus should always appear on top of the objects in the photograph, appears behind the object in this scene, clearly revealing a composite of two pictures into one.
Even Sibrel's own example shows this claim to be untrue. The shadows here change direction according to the terrain. Here are some more examples. The appearance of a shadow also depends on your perspective to it and distance from it. Note the angle of the shadow cast by the rock in this photograph taken from directly above. Now we see the same rock from a distance of 25 feet. The angle of the shadow has changed. The same rock again from a distance of 50 feet. Now the shadow is almost horizontal. Note also how the shadows of the rock and the nearby stake are different. Sibrel uses this photograph from Apollo 17 as the supposed impossible example. And when we recreate this on Earth on level ground with a similar sun angle, we see the impossible claim is obviously false. These photographs are easily found in all the places you would expect them to be. There are dedicated sections on Flickr and Facebook, along with a number of NASA websites. Why is it necessary for Sibrel to pretend that famous photographs like this have been hidden away and are only now being exposed as a result of his research? In my opinion, there is a common desire among many conspiracy theorists to believe that they have discovered and are revealing previously secret information. The hotspot is a result of what is known as phase angle. This diagram shows the field of view of a camera. The yellow lines show the direction of sunlight, which is at 90 degrees to the centre of the field of view. This is the phase angle. In this second example, the photographer is facing in a different direction. Now the sunlight is arriving from directly behind him, forming a phase angle of 0 with the centre of his field of view. Objects on and near this line will hide their own shadows, which will be cast directly behind them, causing an apparent brighter area in the centre of the resulting photograph. This 0 phase angle can occur along any line of the field of view, not necessarily along the centre, as in this third example, where the 0 phase angle is at the edge of the field of view. Direct sunlight is not the only light source on the moon. Some light is reflected from the lunar surface and from objects on it. NASA wanted a photographic record of an astronaut exiting the lunar module on the moon, so Armstrong moved to a position a few feet away to photograph Aldrin's egress. So although the hatch of the lunar module is in shadow, Armstrong is standing in bright sunlight in a Teflon-coated white spacesuit. We can see its bright glow from the TV camera, and this is what is lighting up the scene.
Got an inch clearance on top of your bliss. Okay, you need a little bit of arching of the back to come down.
The now famous C rock is from this Apollo 16 photograph. A 2001 investigation discovered that this mark does not appear on the original transparency or on copies of it that were made and distributed prior to 1997. It was discovered that a print of the image held at the Lunar and Planetary Institute in Houston was the source of the mark. At some point, this print had been scanned and has since been widely distributed on the internet. Close examination shows what looks like a shadow underneath the C. showing that this is probably an eyelash, hair or some other fibre that was on the surface of the print when it was scanned. This rock was actually photographed twice. It also appears in the previous photo on the same film reel. The transparency in copies of this photo have never shown a letter C on the rock. The Hasselblad cameras used on the Apollo missions were fitted with a réseau plate. This was a glass sheet with crosses called fiducial marks etched into it. The film in the camera was pressed against this plate so that the crosses were recorded onto every exposure. This accidental exposure from Apollo 11 shows this well. The precise distances between the crosses are known, so if the image is distorted by the camera lens or by slight movement of the film, these distortions can be known and corrected for. By comparing photographs with similar targets, the crosses can also be used to determine the angular distance between objects. In Sibrel's example from Apollo 16, the cross appears to be behind part of the lunar rover. Here is another example from Apollo 11. At first glance, the lunar surface close-up camera appears to be in front of the cross, but if we look closely we can see the cross is still there. It's just very faint as it's being washed out by the bright white object behind it. Here are some more examples. We can see in each of these cases the crosses are partially obscured by the bright white overexposed area of the photograph, showing that Sibrel has cherry-picked an image that confirms his bias and not thoroughly researched this issue. In part 4 we answer a popular hoaxer question. Why is there no blast crater beneath the lunar module? Part 4. No blast crater. In this section we take a closer look at the lunar surface and how it was affected by the landing. As always, I'll address each claim after the clip.
Someone apparently forgot to create a burn crater underneath the lunar module's 10,000-pound thrust engine, despite the fact that during ground tests there was a real concern for the vehicle falling into the hole the engine created as it descended. Here is a depiction based on the latest specifications and scientific data. In these enlargements, it looks as though the lunar module was simply placed there, not even one speck of moon dust on the landing pod. As a result, all subsequent flights had to have the same discrepancy, which was explained away by the effect of no atmosphere.
This blast crater claim is a hoaxer favourite, and here as usual it is offered without any quantifiable justification. The lunar module descent engine, known as the Descent Propulsion System, or DPS, could produce 10,000 pounds per foot of thrust. This was throttleable down to about 1,000 pounds. Managing the descent and hovering over the lunar surface wasn't this engine's only task. The DPS also had to perform orbital manoeuvres at the start of the descent when the lunar module was fully laden with fuel, and it had to be able to put the lunar module back into lunar orbit in an abort situation. We know that just prior to landing, the DPS was producing 2,600 pounds of thrust. To put this into context, we can compare with the thrust output of some other engines. A Harrier jump jet, for instance, produces more than 8 times the thrust of the DPS at landing, and we do not expect to or see it leaving burn marks or craters. It will, however, blow up some dust, as did the lunar module. We can see it in the landing film, and hear Aldrin refer to it as he calls out an altitude of 40 feet.
40 feet down, 2.5, picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down, straight shadow. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. 20, down a half. 30 seconds forward, just. Okay. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. ACA at a descent. Mode control both auto, descent engine command override off. Engine arm off. Port 13 is in. We copy you down, Eagle. Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Closer inspection of the photos taken of Eagle's engine bell show further evidence of the engine's thrust, with obvious radial scoring on the ground beneath. This claim is a distortion of the truth. In 1955, astrophysicist and NASA consultant Thomas Gold hypothesized that the moon was covered by a layer of fine rock dust several feet thick, stemming from, quote, the ceaseless bombardment of its surface by solar system debris, unquote. This led to the dust being jokingly referred to as gold dust, and this hypothesis was ridiculed by some other scientists. Gold initially suggested that spacecraft and astronauts would sink into the dust, but upon later analysis of impact craters and electrostatic fields, he determined that the astronauts' boots would sink only 3 centimeters into the moon's surface, a prediction which ultimately turned out to be true. Debate and fears over this remained until NASA completed 5 successful robotic landings of the unmanned Surveyor spacecraft. I can't be certain of the source of this image, which Sibrel tells us is based on the latest specifications and scientific data, but I do know it is included in this children's book from 1963. If you find any of Sibrel's arguments compelling, you should be asking yourself why fibs like this are necessary. As we have seen, dust was blasted away by the lunar module descent engine, but there is no atmosphere on the moon, so no way for this dust to billow in clouds and then settle. It would simply be blasted away following a ballistic trajectory. Neil Armstrong described this in a 2001 interview. He said, "I was absolutely dumbfounded when I shut the rocket engine off and the particles that were going out radially from the bottom of the engine fell all the way out over the horizon. And when I shut the engine off, they just raced out over the horizon and instantaneously disappeared. You know, just like it had been shut off for a week. That was remarkable. I'd never seen that. I'd never seen anything like that. And logic says, yes, that's the way it ought to be there. But I hadn't thought about it, and I was surprised." Despite the claim to the contrary, there are examples from later flights of lunar dust on the landing pads. Dust isn't the only thing that Mr. Sibrel feels is missing from the Apollo photographs. In Part 5, we address his claims over the lack of stars. Part 5. No stars. In this section, we look at why the Apollo photographs don't depict stars. As usual, I will highlight a list of claims and then address each in turn.
And what about stars? On the moon, with no atmosphere, they must have been quite a sight to behold. Yet there is seldom any mention of them, if ever, by any of the astronauts on any of the missions. Undoubtedly, creating a mural with all the constellations properly placed in the sky would have been virtually impossible to create accurately, much less realistically. A competent amateur astronomer would have been able to call attention to the slightest error in measurement. The answer? Not to talk about the stars. Ever. In their post-flight press conference, it was the only question to which Neil Armstrong responded with an absence of memory.
When you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars and the solar corona in spite of the glare?
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon without looking through the optics. I don't recall during the period of time that we were photographing the solar corona what stars we could see. I don't remember seeing any.
Years later, though, Michael Collins would remember seeing the elusive stars and wrote about them in Expeditions to the Moon. It seems his memory improved the older he got. Why don't stars appear in any of the photographs? Simply because the proper, mostly closed exposure setting for the camera's iris, set that way to compensate for the bright sunlight on the moon's surface, completely diminished the faintness of relatively distant specks of diminutive light. This answer is true. It does not, however, explain why they never took any pictures of the stars by themselves, with an exposure setting perfect for them. While they took 3 automobiles to the moon, they never took a photographic telescope. Had they done so, they would have been able to see farther into the universe than had ever before been realized. If they had taken a telescope and were not actually on the moon, they would have had to concoct undiscovered galaxies that might one day prove to be non-existent.
This is a popular misconception that we would not expect from someone who has thoroughly researched this subject. Because the lunar sky is black, we tend to think that the viewing conditions are the same as at night here on Earth. This is not so. Astronauts' eyes and camera apertures would be adjusted to bright sunlight, and so the relatively faint stars would not be visible or appear in photographs. As we heard Neil Armstrong say in the post-flight press conference, stars are not visible from the daylight side of the moon without using the optics, which had an eyepiece which blocked out other light. Stars are mentioned dozens of times on every mission, because star sightings were used to check and correct for drift in the inertial guidance system, which showed the crew the spacecraft's position in space. The command and lunar modules had a sextant and telescope, which were used to target 2 or 3 stars from the guidance computer's catalogue and mark their positions. From this, the computer could calculate the spacecraft's actual position in space. This procedure was performed 3 times on each leg of the journey, with astronauts naming stars every time, sometimes by their regular name and sometimes using their computer number code.
Well, star number 30 looks like it's right dab smack in the middle of the sextant. Houston, roger out. 0350. Vega and Deneb, 071 291 341.
In one of the live TV broadcasts made on the journey, Buzz Aldrin describes his star chart, used to aid the recognition of stars.
Pointing up in this direction, we see out our side windows the sun going by, and of course out one of our windows right now we've got the Earth. Now right behind my window, of course we have the sun is illuminating the star chart that we see. This line represents the ecliptic plane, and these lines, vertical lines, represent our reference system that the spacecraft is using at this time. As we approach the moon will gradually grow larger and larger in size, and eventually it will be in eclipse. It will be eclipsing the sun as we go behind it, as we approach the lunar orbit insertion maneuver.
When the sun is eclipsed, as Buzz is describing, the stars become visible. Neil Armstrong described this on day 4 of the mission here.
Houston, it's been a real change for us. Now we're able to see stars again and recognize constellations for the first time on the trip. The sky's full of stars, just like the night side of Earth. But all the way here, we've only been able to see stars occasionally and perhaps through the binocular, but not recognize any star patterns. I guess it's turned into night up there, really, hasn't it?
As the sun became occluded by the moon, the Apollo 11 crew photographed it. They took 44 exposures. Here are a few. This is what Patrick Moore is referring to when he asks this question at the press conference.
When you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars and the solar corona in spite of the glare?
Patrick Moore is not asking if they could see stars. He is asking if they saw stars in the solar corona, a question specifically about the time when the sun was eclipsed. Neil Armstrong said he didn't recall what stars were seen. Michael Collins said he didn't see any. Again, he is referring to the time when they were observing the solar corona. This does not contradict what he said in Expeditions to the Moon, which, like the description we heard from Neil Armstrong, was an account of day 4 of the mission, when the moon eclipsed the sun. He said, "To add to the dramatic effect, we can see stars again. We are in the shadow of the moon now, and the elusive stars have reappeared." In astronomical terms, there is little difference between the positions of stars when viewed from the moon and the Earth. As we have just seen, stars were used for navigation, so their exact positions at every point in the journey had to be known. We have had accurate planetaria for decades and accurate star maps for centuries. There is no reason at all that accurate stars couldn't have been added to an image if deception was the goal. This is incorrect. Apollo 16 carried the far ultraviolet camera spectroscope, specifically for this purpose. It was set up to take pictures in the ultraviolet part of the spectrum. Here are some of the images it recorded. In part 6 we look at a number of claims including the cost of the lunar rovers, astronauts' faces in photos, and the hoaxer classic, flags blowing in the wind. Part 6, Blowing Flags. Next we look at the classic claim that flags planted on the moon can be seen blowing in the wind, and later the claim that there are no photographs showing astronauts' faces taken on the moon. First though, Mr. Cabral has a problem with the cost of developing the lunar rover.
The cost of the 3 moon rovers in 21st century currency? Nearly $60 million each, though they had fewer parts than a Jeep. Where was all this money going? Then there's the flag, blowing in the wind, at least twice, on the atmosphereless moon. We can only guess that most of the missions were staged inside, for fear of possible aerial or satellite reconnaissance from an unfriendly nation. The backpacks, designed for 1/6 gravity, must have had the cooling systems removed to allow for movement without falling over. With very near and hot studio lighting, that left one hot astronaut inside. Assuming that it was the astronauts inside, after all, their faces were always covered. The necessary mammoth amounts of air conditioning were probably responsible for the air current. Here the editor cuts to a still shot of the flag, just as the effect becomes noticeable. Here it is unchecked. This rare clip, attained decades ago, was never re-released, with the inevitable increase in experience and scrutiny.
Firstly, 4 lunar rovers were built and 7 test rovers, not 3. Although the development cost sounds expensive, it's actually very cheap when compared with the development costs of other vehicles. For instance, Volkswagen estimate the development cost of their latest Golf generation at $1.2 billion, while BMW spent $800 million developing their 7 Series. So to develop and test a vehicle with the unique requirements of the lunar rover at this price really can't be seen as anything other than a good deal for NASA. The first clip shown is from the colour TV camera on the lunar rover of Apollo 17, and we are told that the editor cuts to a still shot of the flag just as the effect becomes noticeable. We have to assume that the editor that Cabral is referring to is himself, because the clip is easily available without this still flag image inserted. We also hear both astronauts talk about the flag waving effect.
Maybe it'll, that's what it looks like, it's waving in the breeze. Yes, sir. How about right there? Okay, well, it does wave when you do that. We got a beautiful picture, you guys, up down there. Let me tell you, Bob, this flag is a beautiful picture.
The second clip, which we are told is rare and was obtained decades ago, again is easy to find and is from the 16mm data acquisition camera of Apollo 14. And because the camera was set to expose 1 frame per second, it is running at the wrong speed. Here it is with the speed corrected. The Apollo lunar flag assembly consisted of a telescoping tubular flagpole that was shoved or hammered into the lunar soil. At the top of this pole was a hinged horizontal support that locked into place and kept the flag in a flying position. We can see this assembly has some spring to it, so when the flag is deployed it flaps back and forth as if it is waving. With no atmosphere on the moon to dampen this movement, it continues to wave for a little while, sometimes when the astronaut is no longer touching the flagpole. We can see from this image of the flag assembly before it was packed the rippled folds of the flag that make it appear to be fluttering in still images. We can also find many examples from multiple photos and from video which show the flag absolutely static. What happened to Cabral's massive amounts of air conditioning for these shots? Usually the astronauts work with the gold-plated helmet visor down, but there are occasions, for instance when they have been working in shadow, when they raise the visor and were caught on film. Here are some examples. In part 7 we look at the TV that was broadcast from the moon and investigate the claim that slow motion was used to create the effect of lunar gravity. Part 7. Slow motion and poor quality TV. In this part we take a look at the TV broadcast from the moon and the claim that slow motion was used to fake lunar gravity. As usual, I will identify a list of claims first and then address them one by one.
To demonstrate 1/6 gravity, a bouncy, floaty feel to the astronauts' movements would be similarly achieved with relative simplicity. Slow motion. You are viewing the scenes as they aired more than 30 years ago. Now let's look at them with the speed doubled. It becomes discernible that they are, in fact, in Earth's gravity, and are no more leaving the ground than they would on Earth. It is clear from these rarely seen colour television pictures that the crew of Apollo 11 brought a high-resolution colour video camera with them on their mission, yet the only pictures broadcast live from the moon's surface were these from a low-definition black and white camera. In fact, the networks complained because in addition to this, they were forced to shoot the images, second generation, off of a projection TV of the technology of 30 years ago, and were not even allowed to take a direct feed, which further degraded the quality and clarity of the images. Better to open up their debut mission with fuzzy pictures and numerous blackouts, rather than show too much revealing detail of a false scene that was yet unproven.
There are some fine details we can check to see if this claim is true. In this sequence from Apollo 14, we can see astronauts Ed Mitchell and Alan Shepard unloading equipment from the scientific equipment bay of the lunar module. To their right, we see a lanyard swinging. We can estimate the length of this lanyard and we can check the time of its swing, called the period. We can then use this equation for calculating the swing of a pendulum to derive the gravitational acceleration being exerted upon it. This comes to 1.54 meters per second squared, which, allowing for a margin of error, is close enough to the actual gravitational acceleration on the moon of 1.62 meters per second squared, and obviously not close at all to Earth's 9.8 meters per second squared. We can switch the pendulum equation around to figure out how much we need to speed up the video to make the lanyard swing as it would in Earth's gravity. Or, as Cabral would have us believe, restore the video to its original state before it was slowed to create fake lunar gravity. This comes to 246%, a bit faster than Cabral suggested. When we speed the video up by this amount, we see really frantic, unnatural movements from the astronauts, and in objects like the lanyard cord they are working with. Here is another example of a gravitational acceleration calculation, this time using a falling bag, and it gives the same result. We can take the known height of the astronaut's backpack and use it as a guide to measurement. And we get a similar result to the first clip. So when we speed up the footage by the same amount, here earlier in the same clip, we get the same unnatural movements from the astronaut. Here are some more comparisons. The astronauts were not trying to propel themselves as high as possible. They were trying to achieve controlled motion in a low-gravity environment. They obviously adjusted their walk and how much pressure they exerted with each step to this environment, so we would not expect them to be leaping around as Sibrel seems to. Once again, Sibrel feels the need to imply that he is revealing secrets that no one else has seen or noticed. Obviously, television broadcasts from Apollo 11 have been seen by millions of people and are easy to find from a number of internet sources. Although this is true of Apollo 11, there were good reasons for this. A standard US television signal sends 30 frames per second. Each frame is composed of 525 horizontal lines of information. The TV signal describes the colour and intensity of different points along each horizontal line. So it takes a lot of radio bandwidth, data carrying capacity, to transmit a high quality television signal. The size of the transmitting and receiving antenna has a lot to do with how complex a signal you can transmit over distance. The lunar module's built-in antenna was only 1 meter in diameter and could not send as strong and as clear a signal as the freestanding S-band antenna used on Apollos 12 and 14. Apollo 11 mission planners didn't want the crew to spend 30 minutes of their 2-hour moonwalk setting up this antenna. Besides, the world wanted to see Armstrong take his first steps on television, which wouldn't be possible if they had to wait for the large antenna to be set up. The original timing of Apollo 11's moonwalk put the big radio telescopes at Goldstone and Honeysuckle Creek on the wrong side of the Earth to receive the signal, meaning the smaller antennas of the manned spaceflight network, which were not capable of picking up a weak complex signal, would have to be used. So the engineers decided to reduce the complexity of the TV signal. There are a number of ways this was done. First, they dropped the colour information. If you only have to send intensity information, i.e. black and white pictures, you can cut the bandwidth by 2/3. Then they reduced the number of horizontal lines. This of course reduced the clarity of the image, but it cut the signal size by 1/3. Then they reduced the number of frames per second. This reduced it by 2/3. The result was a signal that could be squeezed into the limited data carrying capacity of the small antenna, requiring only about 5% of the information of a standard full-colour signal. But this TV signal was no longer compatible with the standard equipment on the ground, so a low-tech solution was used. It's relatively easy to modify a standard television tube to display this slow-course signal from Apollo 11. Then a standard television camera was aimed at this TV screen, producing a television signal at the correct frame rate and resolution for broadcast. NASA supplied sharper, clearer, lengthier telecasts as time went on, and today you can buy detailed, high-quality digital copies of all the Apollo visual material, inviting closer and closer scrutiny. If the purpose of the grainy Apollo 11 television was to hide the wires, why risk exposing those wires later? NASA was trying to meet Kennedy's challenge of landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade. Kennedy had said nothing about sending back television pictures, collecting rocks, and setting up experiments. Apollo 11's mission objective was simply to land and return safely, and anything that would delay that simple mission was given lower priority. Colour television did not contribute to the probability of mission success, and so it was omitted on Apollo 11. NASA did not plan for Apollo 11 to be the only mission. Therefore, they didn't intend Apollo 11 to single-handedly accomplish the objectives of the entire program. It was understood that subsequent missions would build on Apollo 11's success and take advantage of the lessons learned, and therefore have greater expectations. And so to fulfill the primary goal, certain secondary goals were allowed to be delayed. Extensive experimentation, astronomy, high-quality photography, the lunar rover. Apollo 11 was sent to the moon on time to meet Kennedy's challenge, even though the technology not directly related to the landing was still being developed and tested. Whilst it's true that the TV quality was poor, it is simply untrue to claim that there were numerous blackouts. There was a single 6-second break in the 2.5-hour Apollo 11 moonwalk TV transmission. Well, it's been an arduous journey through misunderstanding, mischaracterization and misinformation. But we have made it through to the big climax. In the final section of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, Sibrel reveals what he claims is secret footage of the Apollo 11 crew faking their mission. Part 8. The Smoking Gun. Now it's time to address the notorious so-called smoking gun footage, which Sibrel claims shows the crew of Apollo 11 faking their mission. There are just 2 pieces of footage used, although we will be told there are several more. In this part we will deal with the first of these, an unscheduled TV transmission made 10 hours into the mission. Unlike the previous parts of this video, I won't identify a list of claims this time. Instead, I will address the claims about the footage step by step.
And finally, the element that seals their fate. Of all the footage of Apollo 11 requested from NASA over a 5-year period, 1 gem was discovered just before the completion of this documentary. An old reel received by mistake. It contains the raw or unedited footage of the crew of Apollo 11, Michael Collins, Edwin Aldrin Jr. and Neil Armstrong, staging part of their mission for nearly an hour in living color, with exceptionally clear behind-the-scenes audio of conversations discussing the techniques used to achieve a disingenuous picture depicting the Earth at a distance, in order to falsely demonstrate their far journey from it and their ability to survive passing through the Van Allen radiation belts. It cannot be misconstrued that this staging was done for some other reason prior to the mission, for the reel itself is slated and dated July 18th, 19th and 20th, 1969, the very days of the mission when they were said to be approaching and achieving lunar orbit. Furthermore, it is apparent they are in genuine zero gravity aboard the actual spacecraft, necessary to convince the mass media of their authenticity, just not any further than Earth orbit, as you will see. In this never-before-seen or heard footage, not only is the radio conversation between the astronauts and Houston Control audible, there is a secondary, private conversation taking place between the crew and a third confidential party, prompting the astronauts with what to say, when to speak, and how to effectively manipulate the camera to achieve the desired misleading effect. NASA claims that the Houston transmissions were the only ones taking place with the astronauts. Listen now as Houston Control initiates a conversation with the crew, only to find them too preoccupied with the behind-the-scenes trickery to respond. Moments pass and the oversight is picked up on by the clandestine third party, who quickly prompts them with talk. Immediately, Neil Armstrong speaks.
Oh, Apollo 11, Houston, Goldstone says that the TV looks great. Over. Okay, Roger, we're moving in on Earth.
The first clip comes from an unscheduled TV transmission known as GET 1032. GET stands for Ground Elapsed Time, in this case 10 hours and 32 minutes after launch. At this time the spacecraft was about 50,000 miles from Earth. The crew had just finished a course correction procedure and were planning on putting the spacecraft into passive thermal control mode, or PTC, a slow rotation to keep temperatures balanced around the craft. The crew shot these photos of Earth while the PTC data was being uploaded to the flight computer from Mission Control. When this was completed, they were given the go-ahead to start the PTC, but Armstrong suggested a delay. I have removed a few gaps between the communications here in the interests of brevity.
Hello, Apollo 11, Houston. Your rates look really great now. You can start your PTC. Okay, thanks, Ryan. Houston, you're 11. Roger, go ahead, 11, over. Roger, if you'd like to delay PTC entrance for 10 minutes or so, we can shoot you some TV of a 7/8 Earth. We'll leave that up to you. Roger, stand by. Hello, Apollo 11. Houston, we'll have an answer for you on the TV in about 1 minute, over. Houston, we're ready at Goldstone for the TV. It'll be recorded at Goldstone and then replayed back over here. Niels, anytime you want to turn it on, we're ready, over. Okay, it'll take us about 5 minutes to get rigged. Roger.
So it was decided to broadcast footage of the Earth before starting the PTC, when the rotating spacecraft would make this difficult. Flight controller Charlie Duke then advises the crew the broadcast will be recorded and played back later. So the crew and the watching press now know that there is to be a TV transmission and that the entire thing will be recorded and played back later. So the idea that the crew or anyone else believed any part of this transmission was behind the scenes is obvious nonsense. Likewise, the claim that this footage is never before seen or heard is also untrue. 6 minutes later, Armstrong is ready to start the transmission.
Okay, Houston, we are sending a picture of Earth down right now, so you can let us know if they're receiving in Goldstone. Roger, 11. Goldstone is receiving the TV. Stand by and we'll let you know on the quality, over.
Then the TV transmission begins, and we hear what we are told is a clandestine third party giving stage directions.
Hello, Apollo 11. Houston, Goldstone says that the TV looks great, over. Okay, Roger, we're zooming in on Earth.
Let's listen to that a couple more times. It's very difficult to tell quite what is being said here. Once we are told it is the word talk, it sounds like that, but it really isn't that clear. Throughout the Apollo missions, there are hundreds of examples of similar unidentified radio traffic. But from this single word, if it is a word, Sibrel has inferred a director and actors. Why would this clandestine third party feel the need to prompt the astronauts at this point? There are pauses in communications between ground and crew all the time, sometimes minutes long. And yet we are supposed to believe that the moment this secret director knew that a recording was being made that would be played back and broadcast, he was so incensed by a few seconds of dead air that he decided to speak on a channel that was broadcast to press and public and risk exposing the entire hoax. And why would such a person even have this functionality available to them? We are also told that this failure to respond occurs because the crew are preoccupied with setting up the hoax and have forgotten that they are broadcasting. And yet this is only 80 seconds after Armstrong announced that he had started transmitting. Okay, back to the film.
Again, the illusion they are attempting to create is the Earth at a distance to demonstrate their far journey from it and their ability to survive passing through the Van Allen radiation belts. Understand, too, that only about 20 seconds of this raw footage was ever broadcast to the public, and these conversations discussing their deception were believed to be private. Until now. Here they discuss that these television transmissions were in fact not broadcast live as everyone believed. They were first screened and edited for playback later.
Roger, Neil, we just wanted a narrative such that we can, when we get to playback, we can sort of correlate what we're seeing. Thank you very much.
There is no evidence for this 20-second claim. There were hundreds of people working at Goldstone where the transmission was received. All of the voice transmission went out live to the press in mission control. There would never be any reason for any astronaut to believe anything they were broadcasting, voice or video, was private in any way. Similarly, no one believed that the transmissions were live. We heard Charlie Duke tell the crew and the press and public the opposite.
Houston, we're ready at Goldstone for the TV. It'll be recorded at Goldstone and then replayed back over here. Niels, anytime you want to turn it on, we're ready, over.
Mr. Sibrel is creating a story here of secret conversations and deception over live and recorded TV that simply did not exist. Let's hear this exchange about the TV transmission from a little earlier in the recording.
Hello, Apollo 11. Houston, Houston, we'd like you to keep the TV on for about 10 minutes or so we can get some good comparison on the camera. You can do anything you're...
So Mission Controller Charlie Duke is asking the crew to test drive the TV camera and provide narration, so when they watch back later they know what they are seeing. The voice communications are poor at this time, so he repeats this request a few times.
Apollo 11 Houston, we'll try once more on this TV request. We'd like 10 minutes worth of TV, and we'd like a narrative if you could give us one on the exterior shots. We also suggest you might try an interior position. Over. Roger. We're seeing the center of the Earth as viewed from the spacecraft in the eastern Pacific Ocean. We have not been able to visually pick up the Hawaiian island chain, but we can clearly see the western coast of North America, the United States, the San Joaquin Valley, the High Sierras, Baja California, and Mexico down as far as Acapulco and the Yucatan Peninsula, and you can see on through Central America to the northern coast of South America, Venezuela and Colombia. I'm not sure you'll be able to see all that on your screens down there. Roger, Neil. We just wanted a narrative such that we can, when we get the playback, we can sort of correlate what we're seeing. Thank you very much.
Again, there is absolutely nothing private about this. Thousands of people heard this exchange as it happened. And what we heard was a perfectly natural exchange between Mission Control and the crew, working to get the best possible TV picture. There is nothing unusual or clandestine about this. All of the video is readily available, as are the voice recordings and transcripts. Okay, give your eyes a rub because we are about to start seeing things. Oh, and hearing things.
Here they discuss the fact that they have turned out the lights and have blocked out sunlight from entering the spacecraft through the other windows, as to not cause any reflected light to fall onto the spacecraft's wall in the foreground.
Okay, very good. Well, we shut out the sun coming in some of the other windows into the spacecraft, so it's looking through the number one window, and there isn't any reflected light.
Before we go any further with this part, let's get some context for what Aldrin just said. Here is the conversation from the original recording.
Okay, my comments were from Goldstone that they see no white spots as we saw in 10. Looks like the AGC is working real well. The F-22 looks good. Over. Okay, very good. Well, we shut out the sun coming in some of the other windows into the spacecraft, so it's looking through the number one window, and there isn't any reflected light. Now, so it ought to be a pretty good picture. Roger.
Mission Controller Charlie Duke is talking about some white spots that appeared on the TV picture from Apollo 10. Aldrin responds by reassuring him that they have blocked out as much light as they can to prevent reflections off the windows. Something we have all done when trying to view a dark outside from a light inside, or vice versa. Aldrin doesn't mention the walls at all, even though Sibrel includes this in the transcript as if he did. Okay, so why does Sibrel say they need to stop light reflections from the walls?
The reason this was done is so that the truth of the matter would not be revealed. It is this. Though the federal government would have you believe that this is a view of Earth from a distance out of the spacecraft's window as it nears the moon, it is not. What they have ingeniously done is placed the camera at the back of the spacecraft and centered the lens on a circular window in the foreground, outside of which it is completely filled with the Earth in low orbit. The circumference of the window then appears to be the diameter of the Earth at a distance, with the darkened walls of the spacecraft appearing to be the blackness of space around it. That is why they wanted the interior dark and blocked out the sun from entering through the other windows.
There are a number of significant problems with this idea. Firstly, this is what the Earth looks like from a spacecraft in low Earth orbit. If we add in a spacecraft and window, and black out the interior lights, this is what we get. The Earth apparently rolling by the window like a conveyor belt. Nothing like what we see in the TV transmission. So we know this assertion cannot possibly be true. Secondly, Aldrin has just told us he is shooting through the number 1 window, which is trapezoidal in shape and not circular. The main hatch window was circular, but only on the inside. The outside of it was a rounded rectangle. This detail becomes important when we hear what is proposed next.
Here you can see the extruded window, probably 2 inches thick at the bottom. This is because the Earth's shine is coming in at a downward angle. It also causes the Earth to appear to be an irregularly shaped circle, for you are seeing the outside of the window at the bottom and the inside of the window at the top, which together form 2 different sized halves of a circle. Subsequently, this take was never used.
We know that again this cannot be true because there were no circular outside windows. It gets worse though. See why in Part 9, The Smoking Gun 2. Part 9, The Smoking Gun. In this section we take a look at the second piece of TV footage presented as evidence of fakery. This next clip is from GET 3359, a scheduled live TV transmission made about a day later than the first transmission.
As they perfected the shot, a crescent-shaped piece of black material was inset slightly into the window to create the illusion of the Earth's terminator line dividing night and day. It is uncannily convincing.
The big question that springs to mind here is where? Where is this piece of material? What evidence is there of its existence? We are told it is there, and in my experience, most viewers of this movie believe they have seen it. But it is simply asserted by the narrator. All we see is the Earth surrounded by solid blackness.
During this segment, intended to be edited and played back later for the worldwide television audience, dated July 18, 1969, Neil Armstrong condemns himself as he states that he is 130,000 miles out, or halfway to the moon, as the NASA flight log also states on this date, when he is in reality in low Earth orbit of a few hundred miles.
Roger, Houston, Apollo 11. Calling in from about 130,000 miles out.
We know that this was not intended to be edited and played back later because the broadcast is listed in advance in newspapers of the time. It started precisely on time and went out live.
Here, during another segment, also intended to air after review, Neil Armstrong falsely explains to the viewers how the shot is attained by putting the camera's lens to the window's glass, as it would have to be if they were the claimed distance away from the Earth.
We only have one window that has a view of the Earth, and it's filled up with a TV camera.
If the window was completely filled up with a TV camera, as he stated, then an astronaut's arm would not be able to get between the camera and the window, as it obviously does here in this outtake.
South America becomes invisible just off beyond the Terminator or inside the shadow.
You can also notice how the astronaut operating the camera reacted to the mistake by attempting to pan away from it.
Blue cast. See white bands of major cloud formations across the Earth.
This clip is actually from the same live scheduled TV transmission, 10 minutes further on, not a different one. Again, advertised in advance, broadcast on time, and reported on afterwards. We are told without any reasoning at all that to record the Earth at this distance, the camera would have to be against the window's glass. Moreover, we are told that Armstrong explains this. He doesn't say anything of the sort. He simply states that the camera is filling the window and not completely filling the window. Let's get some context to this from slightly earlier in the conversation. Pauses edited for brevity.
11, Houston, could you describe, from your view, the polar cloud cap appears to us to extend down the western coast of North America Would you estimate how far it extends down? Over. Trying to fit everybody into the window. It appears that the cloud cap comes down a little bit below the southern extremity of Alaska. Roger. We've 11. We've lost our picture here now. Okay, Apollo 11, Houston, we've got the picture back now. Unfortunately, we only have one window that has a view of the Earth, and it's filled up with the TV camera, so your view now is probably better than ours is. Roger, we copy.
So we see Aldrin tells us that all three astronauts are around the window. The camera we can see is handheld, between the astronauts and the window. And this isn't leaving a lot of room for Armstrong to get a good view of the Earth and describe it. There is nothing to indicate an astronaut's arm. I think it's probably the edge of the window. But even if it was an astronaut's arm, so what? This isn't some mysterious thing that needs to be quickly covered up. It's just an astronaut trying to aim a camera while floating weightless in a cramped spacecraft, probably distracted for a moment. They were aiming to keep the Earth in shot, and when he realised the camera had drifted, he adjusted it accordingly. Remember, the only person to tell us that the camera is against the window's glass, and has to be, was the narrator. Okay, we're down to the big reveal.
This is a segment that they believed wasn't even being recorded, much less suitable for broadcast, for the lens was being zoomed out and the scene was being changed to that of an interior of the astronauts at work, and apparently the stop button popped back up on the recorder without notice. Here is the diffused work light that they used to see camera controls, but not throw light onto the spacecraft's wall. Here they remove part of the crescent insert. Finally, the iris is opened up and you can see the real location of the camera and the very bright and near Earth out the window. Here is the slate for the 19th of July, and the same shot of trickery on the 19th of July, and then the 20th, and the same misleading shot on the 20th. Later that evening, they were said to be walking on the moon. How can this be when they were in Earth orbit only 9 hours earlier, and the moon is some 3 days' journey away? Furthermore, if they genuinely went to the moon, why would they be faking any part of it? Why this trickery with the window? By faking being halfway to the moon, it becomes apparent that they did so because they could not even go halfway. It thus confirms that the stumbling block to their success was the lethal radiation of the Van Allen radiation belts. Since the same equipment was used on the subsequent missions in the 40 months that followed, none of them could have gone to the moon. They only increased their proficiency at staging them.
Well, since they keep saying it, I will too. This is from the same scheduled live TV transmission. The crew knew that they were live across the USA. They are pointing the camera at the Earth and providing a commentary. What would be the purpose of this if they didn't think that they were even being recorded? This supposed accidentally revealed scene change was detailed in the commentary. We will pick this up right where we left off the last time.
Unfortunately, we only have one window that has a view of the Earth, and it's filled up with the TV camera, so your view now is probably better than ours is. Roger, we copy. 11, Houston, if you could comply, we'd like to see some smiling faces up there. If you could give us some interior views, I'm sure everybody'd like to see you. Over. Okay, we'll reconfigure the TV for that. Roger. Apollo 11, Houston, appears to us that we're seeing a view from outside, plus a little of the inside. It appears you've taken the camera away from the left window. Now, over. That's correct. We're moving it back and reconfiguring for interior lighting. Roger. We can still see the Earth through the left window, and it appears that we can see a floodlight off to the left, either that or some sun shafting through the hatch window. It's a floodlight. Now we're coming in. Can't quite make out who that hatch. That's Big Mike Collins there. Well, you got a little bit of... Yeah, hello there, sports fans. You got a little bit of me, plus Neil's in the center couch, and Buzz is doing the camera work this time. Roger, it's a little dark now, 11. Maybe a bigger f-stop might help. Yeah, that's in work. It's getting a lot better now, 11. Mike, you coming in 5 by, got a good...
So Mission Controller Charlie Duke asked the crew to get some shots inside the spacecraft. Armstrong said they would reconfigure the TV for that. Eventually we saw a floodlight that was behind the camera gradually swim to a position in front of the camera. Charlie Duke noticed they had moved the camera back from the window, and Neil Armstrong confirmed this. And all of this went out live across the USA. The claim that this is the result of a stop button popping back up is a ridiculous fabrication. And this bright sunshine reflecting off the inner glass of the windows we are told is supposed to be the Earth, which Aldrin continues to broadcast to the nation even though apparently it is revealing the hoax. If we jump back 2 hours and 20 minutes, the crew shot some unscheduled TV footage that Mr. Cabral has neglected to show us. Let's take a look. Here we see our familiar shot of the Earth. Oops, what's this? An astronaut's arm maybe? Nope, it's the frame of window 1 again. And as the camera zooms out, we see the Earth and window frame and the interior of the spacecraft. Now the spacecraft rolls and the Earth goes out of view. I will speed this section up a little in the interest of brevity. and soon we see the Earth reappear, this time through a rendezvous window, showing that all of Sibrel's assertions about low Earth orbit, spacecraft windows and inserted pieces of material are figments of his imagination. Okay, it's time to wrap this up. Conclusions in Part 10. Part 10. In conclusion. Okay, let's summarise what we have been shown in A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. In Part 1, a total misunderstanding of radiation types is used to pitch the Van Allen radiation belts as an impenetrable barrier initially kept hidden from the public. In Part 2, illogical and unfounded arguments suggested the USA was incapable of competing with the Soviets in the space race, and that money could be saved with a hoax if only thousands of people could be convinced to keep quiet about it. We also heard a plan for part of the hoax using a satellite that wasn't needed and wasn't capable of fooling the people it needed to. Part 3 offered an analysis of Apollo photography, with entitled and unfounded demands for more photos of this and that, and demonstrably incorrect assertions about shadows and hotspots. In Part 4 we were treated to unqualified claims about missing blast craters, and in Part 5 it was the stars that were missing, with confused and deceptive assertions to support this idea. In Part 6 we saw flags blowing in the wind, and then we saw flags not blowing in the wind. Part 7 suggests slow motion was used to fake lunar gravity, with a single cherry-picked clip and no further investigation, along with several incorrect claims about TV coverage. Finally, in Parts 8 and 9 we saw the supposedly previously secret killer blow smoking gun evidence, which turned out to be nothing but a handful of tiny snippets of TV transmissions coupled with creepy music and more than a handful of outright lies. As I said at the start, this movie is held up as the killer blow for Apollo by many hoax believers. What it actually shows us is how easily those with a strong confirmation bias can be convinced by a very unsophisticated and dishonest piece of movie making. If you're a hoax believer, I'm not suggesting that this video should convince you to change your mind. But if A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon was your reason for disbelieving Apollo, please dump it for the piece of dishonest crap that it actually is and find something else. Thanks for watching, please rate, comment and subscribe.